because it's late, I want to be comfortable, and I'm going to be sharing with you the life of Cardinal Manning. Fascinating life. And I might just begin with a prayer, a couple of prayers from my prayer book. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here, ever this night be at my side, to light, to guard, to rule and guide. Amen. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in the day of battle. Be our safeguard against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do you, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the other evil spirits who prowl through the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. It is now after 11 o'clock, or round about 11 p.m. on Sunday, the 20th of November 2022. I need the sound in front of me because I want to be comfortable while I'm sharing this. I'll read you what's on the back first. It's by Russell Sparks. This new biography, Cardinal Manning, is revealed as one of the greatest men of his age, an inspirational figurehead who inspired a massive depth of affection. A former Anglican clergyman who was widowed after only a few years of marriage, he later became a Catholic and was ordained priest, rising to become Archbishop of Westminster. In his role as primate, he strengthened the structure of the Church and developed a practical ecumenism. He was a champion of papal infallibility and at the same time, this is why I'm reading it, a promoter of Catholic social teaching, pushing for the education of the poor, for a change of policy in Ireland, and acting as a mediator in the Great Dock Strike. W.E. Gladstone, from my plane of thought and life, I can only look at him, Manning, as a man looks at the stars. The writer, the author of this booklet, Russell Sparks, works in the City of London. He is a visiting fellow at St. Mary's University College, and he has written books on G.K. Chesterton and Catholic poetry. So we're going on this journey together. This is from the Catholic Truth Society. Audley, 1912. In close contact with him, one felt that he was always living in the presence of an unseen power, as it is simple and humble messenger. Nothing so impressive, so faith-inspiring, has ever met my eyes as the sight of this noble old Englishman in his threadbare cassock, kneeling before the altar of his bare chapel. One of the greatest men of his age. Men and women. Hilaire Belloc described Cardinal Manning, whom he knew well as a young man, as the greatest of them all. Many contemporaries shared that opinion, nor was admiration of Manning limited to the rich and famous. On the contrary, after Manning's death in 1892, the crowds thronged his funeral procession through the streets of London in a way that had been seen only once before, for the funeral of the Duke of Wellington 40 years earlier. Destroying visceral anti-Catholicism, Just one of Manning's many achievements was the ending of London's previously well-deserved reputation for fear and hatred of Catholicism. The city had been one of the original centres of the Reformation in the 1520s, and it retained its fear and distrust of the Catholic Church for hundreds of years. In the 1678, the mob terrorised the city in the Popish plot disturbances, while just over 100 years later, London was rocked by the No Property Gordon riots. Indeed, when the Catholic hierarchy was re-established in 1850, the government feared that this could lead yet again to anti-Catholic riots in London. Yet a mere 40 years later, this visceral anti-Catholicism had been destroyed, due in large part by Manning's selfless devotion to the poor. Right from the beginning of his ministry, he warned employers of the need to treat workers decently and actively campaigned for better working conditions and housing for the poor, particularly in London. Indeed, when the Great Dock Strike of 1889 threatened to paralyse Victorian Britain, it was the Cardinal, the only authority figure trusted by dock workers, who was able to end it. Bring him back now because he's going to be needed. The same things are going to reoccur, you know that. He was also the main inspirational force behind the flourishing of Catholic social teaching in the last part of the 19th century, culminating in the great social encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891. Conversion and profundity. Born an Anglican, Manning became an archdeacon, a senior figure in the Church of England. After much personal agonizing, he decided in 1851 that he was morally obliged to be received into the Catholic Church, despite the huge blow that this would cause to family and friends. Manning was also noted for his great personal austerity, and as a profound spiritual counsellor, defining infallibility and strengthening the Church. He also played a crucial role in the definition of infallibility at the First Vatican Council of 1869-70. Indeed, the English Catholic Church, as we know it today, is largely Manning's creation. He was the second Archbishop of Westminster, a post he held for an astonishing 27 years. During this time, Manning worked tirelessly to support and teach the Catholic faithful at a time when they were growing rapidly in number. He encouraged the creation of new Catholic schools, opened seminaries to train new priests, and built new churches. The forgotten Victorian. Yet Manning's achievements, and indeed his name, are largely forgotten today. This is strange, as biographies of the most famous Victorians continue to pour off the press. Over 10 books have been published about Florence Nightingale in the last 10 years alone. Even more has been written about Newman, Cardinal Newman. On Manning, nothing. The last new biography about the great cardinal was by Robert Gray 25 years ago. I can't see where this was, what year this was published, but I can put it in what I write up about. There's no dates that I can cast my eyes on. The malice of his biographer, Purcells. Why he is so little known? 2 reasons, I think. The first is that Manning's reputation was deliberately savaged shortly after his death through the malice of his biographer, Purcells, an Irish journalist who was known to have a grudge against him. When Manning died in 1892, his appointed biographer, J.C. Bodley, was abroad. Immediately, Purcells asked to see his papers and proceeded to cart many of them off in a van without any legal right to do so. He then dashed out a large, inaccurate, and heavily biased biography, as Robert Gray puts it. The portrait he drew was of an ecclesiastic consumed by ambition and the will to dominate, prepared to gain his ends by any means, however unscrupulous. To this reader, it seems incontestable that the whole work is pervaded by malice. In his biography, Purcells quite deliberately painted a distorted picture of Manning as a cold, manipulative character who lacked normal emotion but was driven by ambition. Manning expert David Newman agrees about Purcell's bias. The hostile animus of the author is exhibited by the way in which he consistently puts the worst interpretation upon Manning's actions, reflections, and motives. Purcells accuses him of being the victim of ruthless ambition, of exhibiting calculated duplicity in his last years within the Anglican Church. So it makes you wonder whether he's done it because he switched from being, like I did, a Protestant to a Catholic. That's what it's looking like, isn't it? To my mind, what Purcells did was unspeakable. He took Manning's private spiritual journals, in which throughout his life Manning had written down his struggles and determination to live his life to the highest possible spiritual standards, and totally distorted them to depict a monster. I am sure that Manning tried to live a saint-like life of deep spirituality and asceticism, and it was criminal of Purcell to deliberately distort extracts from these journals in order to show Manning as a man eaten up with pride. The opposite was true. As a true ascetic, Manning constantly strove to look at himself in the least flattering light, and his personal reflections show how he ruthlessly exposed and fought against his weaknesses, such as pride and the desire to have his own way. Some 25 years later, when Lytton Strachey was looking for a theme to mock the Victorian period, Purcell's biography inspired him to write a series of 4 essays on leading Victorians called Eminent Victorians: Florence Nightingale, General Gordon, Thomas Arnold of Rugby School, and of course Cardinal Manning. Indeed, the essay on Manning is by far the longest in the book. As Newman states, in fact, it was through reading Purcell's biography in a moment of boredom that Strachey conceived the idea of writing the book. What made Strachey's caricatures so unpardonable was that in using Purcell, he dredged up charges from other sources that he must have known were untrue. The spirit of Vatican I. There is a second reason why I believe Manning has been forgotten. It has been said that Manning's strict dogmatism and emphasis on the authority of the magisterium was in the spirit of Vatican I, whereas Newman's more individual faith, with its greater role for the laity, was in the spirit of Vatican II. In that case, it is no surprise that as Newman's reputation has risen over the last 60 years, Manning's has fallen. However, we live in a period when, as Manning predicted long ago, the Church is coming under increasing attack from secular authorities, curiously enough often in the name of tolerance. I therefore hope that this Catholic Truth Society booklet will help re-establish the truth about Manning, a giant figure in the second spring of English Catholicism. So that was the introduction. So you know there's been some bad things written about him that were untrue. For the author obviously had it in for him and wanted to destroy him. Excuse me. I have an itch. I must stop. So we will now continue with the honest version. Early life and character. He's obviously done a lot of research before he made this booklet. Henry Edward Manning was born on the 15th of July, 1808. The youngest child of the family, he was born into a prosperous background as his father, William Manning, was a rich sugar trader. The family religion was high and dry Anglicanism. with regular attendance at fairly formal Church of England services. The Manning and Wilberforce families. However, the evangelical revival of the second half of the 18th century, started by John Wesley, had led to a return to classic Protestant doctrines of an individual encounter with God directly through the Scriptures. One of the most important of these evangelicals was William Wilberforce, a founder member of the campaign against the slave trade in 1787. There was a strong evangelical influence upon the young Henry Manning, as it was his mother's faith, while there were also links between the Manning and Wilberforce families. Good-looking, with a very strong personality. As a boy, he was notable for two things: being physically good-looking and for having a very strong personality. Throughout his adult life, Manning was well aware that he was a man of great practical talents, shrewd, determined, practical, with a capacity for immense hard work and a powerful ability to influence others. He was an intense, often driven man with a strong sense of duty, while he was attracted to worldly success. His spiritual journals show how he continually fought against these temptations. A stiff upper lip. He would have made a great diplomat, calm, collected, composed. He could listen quietly to others, whilst giving away little of what he really believed. This is why some people thought he was duplicitous. He could have just been wise. I am sure that Manning himself thought he was simply doing his best to do his duty by keeping control of a difficult situation. He could seem aloof, but this reflected the classic Victorian belief that a gentleman kept his emotions under control and did not reveal them, what would later be called a stiff upper lip. A tendency to sniff. Like most affluent children of the period, Manning was educated by private tutors before being sent in 1822, aged 14, to Harrow, one of the great public schools of England. He also suffered severe asthma attacks, which bothered him for the rest of his life. Indeed, his asthma led him to a tendency to sniff, sometimes just expressing irritation or annoyance. Years later, the cardinal's sniff could spread terror among the younger clergy of the diocese. Wary of intimacy. In 1826, he heard news that his sister Harriet, his only close family member, was seriously ill. Dashing home from school, he arrived to find her dying. He wrote, "Her death was a great loss to me and left me alone, the others being so much older as to be no companions to me. Indeed, I think that Harriet's sudden death traumatized the boy and made him wary of intimacy with other people, a personality trait that became overwhelmingly after another catastrophic death 11 years later. The best public speaker in Oxford. In the autumn of 1827, Manning went up to study at Balliol College, Oxford, and in the spring of 1829 he started to attend the newly opened Oxford Union, the University Debating Society. To general surprise, he quickly supplanted the Union's established favourites, such as William Gladstone, with whom he became close friends, to become the best public speaker in Oxford. Later that year, he was elected President of the Oxford Union. Political ambitions. From his youth, Manning had intended to enter the Church of England. However, his success in the Oxford Union turned his head towards politics, and in 1829-1830 he started to study avidly political theory and economics. However, events were to frustrate these plans. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the economy fell into a bitter and prolonged depression. This slump put great pressure on William Manning's business, which failed in 1831. Giving up politics at the dictate of reason and conscience, in this period, politics was dominated, sounds familiar, by rich aristocratic families. With the loss of the family's fortune, Manning's dreams of a political career were more or less over. When he left Oxford in the winter of 1830, his family urged him to go into business, where they retained good contacts, but he felt an insistent religious calling. This feeling that God was calling me worked continually. I told no one. I could not lay it. Every day it grew upon me, and I found myself face to face with this choice: to leave all that I was attracted to and to take up all that I shrunk from. If I made a choice in my life in which my superior will controlled my inferior will, it was when I gave up all the desires, hopes and aspirations after public life at the dictate of my reason and conscience. In 1832, he was elected a Fellow of Merton College, where he devoured the college library of religious works. In December 1832, he became a deacon, the first step towards Anglican priesthood. The evidence suggests that Manning intended to spend several years at Merton, reading theology and pondering his future. But events were about to change his life forever. In late 1832, John Sargent, the rector of Lavington and Graffham, two small villages near Chichester in Sussex, decided that he needed a curate to help him out. Sargent was a highly respected and wealthy evangelical whose family owned the estate of East Lavington and had the right to appoint the vicar of the parish. The Sargent and Wilberforce families were close. John Sargent's wife Mary was a cousin of William Wilberforce, while in 1829 Samuel Wilberforce married Emily Sargent, John's eldest daughter. She was one of his 4 daughters, all generally described as beautiful, with fair hair and a rosy complexion. 18 years at Lavington. In January 1833, Manning went to Lavington for what he thought would be a brief, temporary visit, but he was to stay for 18 years. He arrived in Lavington on the 3rd of January 1833, and by Easter he was engaged to marry Caroline, then aged 21. Virtually nothing is known of the marriage. However, what we do know indicates that they were very happy and devoted to each other. Married by Samuel Wilberforce. However, there was a dark cloud over the Sargent household. The girl's rosy complexion was a sign of the consumption or tuberculosis that was to kill most of them at relatively young age. Events now moved quickly for Manning. The rector, a healthy man in the prime of life, suddenly caught pneumonia and died quite unexpectedly on 3rd of May 1833. His mother decided to use her power of appointment to make Manning the new rector. On 9th of June, he was ordained priest by Bishop Maltby of Chichester. As soon as a respectable 6 months period of mourning was over, Caroline and Manning were married by her brother-in-law, Samuel Wilberforce, on November 7th. Whilst on honeymoon, Manning wrote to her mother Mary a letter which is highly suggestive that Caroline's health was already suffering. She bore the journey surprisingly well and has been more like herself, with vigour and activity she used to show, than I have seen for many, many months. The life of a country parson. When they returned home, Manning settled into the life of a country parson. On becoming rector, he visited all the houses in the parish. Lord Chichester described him as the most exemplary clergyman he had ever known, alike for his parochial zeal and his personal holiness. He was well known for wandering around the parish on foot, visiting the poor and sick, and for his intense spirituality at prayer. Nevertheless, although he tried hard to get to know the local people and played cricket with them, he lacked the common touch. Manning's wife dies of consumption. In July 1835, Manning's sermon in Chichester Cathedral on the English Church was published to national acclaim, and he contributed number 58 of the tracts for the Times in 1837. However, by now his personal life was collapsing. In February 1837, he wrote to Newman, "My wife has been and still is in the state of the most alarming danger. The one who was in an earthly way all things to me seems to be bidden to an early rest." By now, she was exhibiting the bloody cough, symptomatic of the final stages of consumption. She finally died on the 24th of July, 1837, aged only 25. Manning's refusal to talk about it was later seized upon by his critics, as Robert Gray notes. There has been no more vicious, but unfortunately no more enduring, calumny against Manning than Lytton Strachey's snide insinuation that he came to regard Caroline's death as a deliverance from an alliance that would otherwise have held him back from the Catholic priesthood. For many people, it is the sole thing that they remember about Manning. Strachey deliberately perverted his sources to achieve this libel. His longing for his dead wife was like a furnace. Caroline's mother, Mary Sargent, later wrote that her daughter's dying words to her were, "I am sure, Mamma, you will do all you can to take care of Henry." And she remained always supportive of him. Manning forced himself to show little apparent emotion, and he tried to numb the pain through intensive work. Nevertheless, he told Samuel Wilberforce after the burial that his longing for his dead wife was like a furnace, while on the second anniversary of Caroline's death, Mary Sargent discovered him in quite an agony of grief. Father James Pereiro believes that this event forced him in on himself. Manning remained a deeply emotional person throughout his life, but he did not let much out, fearing that he could easily lose control of his feelings. Although he was very close to other women, particularly from his own family, finding great support in them, none of this ever came close to what he had experienced with Caroline. 50 years later, the aged, no gravestone, sorry, was the heading. 50 years later, the aged Archbishop came back to visit Lavington, which had been inherited in 1841 by the Wilberforce family. For several minutes, Manning stood silently, beside the unmarked grave of Caroline. When her nephew, Reginald Wilberforce, dared to asked him why there was no gravestone, the reply came back, "Because I could not put on it the inscription that I should have wished." Every year he received a rose from her grave. There was a touching modern footnote to this story in 1960, when the Oxford academic David Newman was researching Manning's life. A very old lady came to see him. She told him that some 70 years before, as a young girl, her father, Reginald Wilberforce, had sent her every year on the anniversary of Caroline's death to London to give a rose from her grave to the Cardinal. The old man would cherish it and then burst into tears. There was never any question of him remarrying. In 1890, he wrote in his journal that "I have lived as a widower without ever wavering in the purpose of living and dying, as I am now." God, that touches me. The tears just come to my eyes. Oh, yes, I can understand that. The path to Rome. From this time on, Manning became noted for his great personal austerity and as a profound spiritual counsellor. In 1837, he was appointed rural dean, often a sinecure, but not for him. In 1840, his diligence was rewarded when he was appointed archdeacon, the most senior clerical position below that of a bishop. Inattention and uncertainty. When he threw himself into his work after Caroline's death, the temper of Manning's mind demanded that this should have a systemic and well-grounded basis. Unfortunately for Manning, the more he read and thought about theology, the less, rather than the more, secure the spiritual foundations of his life turned out to be. Indeed, the next 14 years, until he was received into the Catholic Church in 1851, were marked by inattention and uncertainty, and even a sense of drift, most unusual for this most purposeful of men. From an evangelical to a more Catholic understanding. Manning continued studying to deepen his spiritual knowledge. His initial views were those of evangelical wing of the Church of England, doubtful of formal liturgy and the sacraments. However, as he read 17th century writers like Hooker and Jeremy Taylor, he moved from an evangelical to a more Catholic understanding of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Hooray, hallelujah. One thing that struck him particularly forcibly when he became a parish priest was how to justify his priestly authority especially among the poor. The first question that rose to my mind was, what right have you to be teaching, admonishing, reforming, rebuking others? By what authority do you lift the latch of a poor man's door and enter and sit down and begin to instruct or correct him? If not a messenger sent from God, I was an intruder and impertinent. The Tractarian movement. This was an extremely unusual way of thinking at a time when the Church of England was regarded as a key component of maintaining the established social order. It was dominated by the state and latitudinarian or lax on doctrinal matters. It was also a period when the Oxford movement or Tractarians powerfully advocated a more Catholic spirit in the Church of England. Their leader was John Henry Newman, whose first tract for the Times had appeared in September 1833. The Tractarian movement was quite a radical, innovative force in the Church of England, combining as it did the deep personal faith and enthusiasm of the evangelicals with the ecclesiastical and sacramental principles of the High Church. However, their advocacy of Catholic practices with the Anglican Church was always controversial, as they were always a small, if vocal minority within the Church of England. Purcells and Strachey's accusations that Manning constantly courted promotion is obvious nonsense, as his Tractarian sympathies actually impeded them. The Rule of Faith, a sermon. In 1838, Manning gave a sermon setting out one of the themes that would occupy him for the rest of his life. For example, that the national interest not only required the education of the poor, extremely prescient for the time, but that the moral health of the country required it to be provided by the Church and not by the state. In June 1838, he came to national prominence with a sermon published under the title, The Rule of Faith. His aim was not to inquire what are the specific doctrines of the gospel, but what is the rule by which we may ascertain them. Indeed, until 1851, the idea of establishing a rule of faith dominated Manning's thinking. His intense nature required certainty of belief, which he thought he found in the tradition of the Church Fathers, going back to the Apostles. He argued that Vincentius fes quod semper quod ubique quod ab omnibus, what was always believed by everybody and everywhere, represented the belief of the one universal Christian Church and was therefore certain or infallible. The unity of the Church a major book. In 1842, Manning published his first major book on theology, dedicated to his friend Gladstone, entitled The Unity of the Church. It argued that the Christian Church was divided into three valid branches: Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Anglican, and put forward the case that it was fidelity to the simple faith of the apostles which enabled the Church to remain united despite its apparent different divisions. In it he stressed the essential teaching role of the Church, without which individual study of the Bible risked turning into subjectivity. Man has a tendency to put subjective opinion in the place of objective truth. It was generally recognized at the time as a major piece of work. A candidate for the highest offices in the Church of England. As the 1840s progressed, Manning's obvious ability meant that he was a candidate for the highest offices in the Church of England. In 1844, the Anglican priest Elias wrote, "Manning is the best spiritual guide we have." The formidable Bishop of Exeter declared, "Manning in the Church, Gladstone in the State, and Hope in the law. No power on earth can keep Manning from the bench of bishops." However, Manning was about to get an enormous shock. Newman converts and Manning becomes uncertain. Newman, the charismatic preacher and leader of the Oxford movement, had increasingly come to doubt his vision of the Church of England as a via media. In October 1843, he wrote in confidence to a shocked and horrified Manning that he had lost faith in the Church of England and was likely to become a Roman Catholic. Although this did not actually happen until 1845, that's 2 years later, in 1845, Newman published his move to Rome by analysing the process of theological development. Gladstone asked Manning to write a rebuttal of this. However, the more he studied it and the issues it raised, the more uncertain he became. It opened my eyes to one fact, namely that I had laid down only half the subject. I had found the rule, but not the judge. It was evident that to put Scripture and antiquity into the hands of the individual is as much private judgment as to put Scripture alone. The perpetuity of the faith must have a higher basis than the individual or collective intellect of the Church. The universal Church of the first 700 years believed in divine, infallible guidance in its office. What does reason say? But that the certitude of revelation to succeeding ages demands a perpetual provision from error, spiritual development. For the next 6 years, this normally determined and purposeful man was drifting. The more he studied Catholic theology, the stronger its case seemed to him, particularly its answer to the question of the rule of faith. As Pereiro has noted in his study of Manning's spiritual development, Manning's mind had a strong inclination and an evident power for synthesis. He may have preached his sermons on apostolic succession and the rule of faith, urged by the questions raised by his pastoral ministry. However, he was always working the knowledge he acquired into a general scheme, always looking for the connections between ideas, trying to integrate principles and concepts into a coherent vision of reality. Rejection of promotion and bitter spiritual anguish. To add to his problems, there were few people he could discuss them with. As an Anglican archdeacon, he was obliged to publicly uphold the doctrines of the Church of England. In December 1845, Manning was offered the post of sub-almoner to the Archbishop of York, generally recognised as a route to the highest offices in the Anglican Church. To general surprise, Manning turned it down. People were expecting and predicting all things for me, and I was making them impossible. Events now moved quickly. He developed a facial tic under the immense strain of being seen as the new leader of the Tractarians, just as his own confidence in their beliefs was failing. In February 1847, his health totally collapsed for 4 months. Coughing up blood, he feared he was dying from consumption, like Caroline 10 years earlier. His journals, written whilst confined to bed in this period, set out bitter spiritual anguish. A visit to Newman and a sign in Milan. When he discovered in July, my eyes are not good. When he recovered in July, he visited Rome, where Newman did not recognize him, as his face was so withered by illness. On his way back home, Manning visited the shrine of St. Charles Borromeo in Milan and took what he felt was a sign. What a wonderful saint. I've just recently done his life too. Lovely saint. I was thinking in prayer, if only I could know that St. Charles, who represents the Council of Trent, was right and we wrong. The deacon was singing the gospel, and the last words, et erit unum ovile et unus pastor, and there will be one flock and one shepherd, came upon me as if I'd never heard them before. Archdeacon Manning resigns, the last straw. A series of political issues also undermined the Tractarian view of the Church of England as independent. The last straw occurred in November 1850, following the restoration of the Catholic hierarchy in England. As Archdeacon, Manning was required to lead a meeting in Chichester Cathedral, repudiating the claims of the newly appointed Cardinal Wiseman. Manning called the meeting to order, but resigned during it. I'd have loved to have been a witness to all this. My old friend, the Dean, was crying, and many others. So we ended and parted. It was our last meeting, and the end of my work in the Church of England. Received into the Catholic faith. He left Lavington for good on 3rd of December 1850 and moved to live with his sister in London. Poignantly, it was only a week after the reconsecration of East Lavington Church, which he had spent years rebuilding. On the 6th of April 1851, he was received into the Catholic faith in London, together with Gladstone's friend, the lawyer, James Hope. Gladstone felt as if Manning had murdered my mother. Oh, what a strong sentence. It was generally accepted that a great future in the Church of England had been thrown away. Gladstone was horrified by the news, saying that he felt as if Manning had murdered my mother and never forgave him. Well, as Christians, we have to forgive 77 times 7 according to Jesus. Prayer and turbulence. After his reception into the Catholic Church, Manning planned to live quietly as a layman for at least a year to take stock of his life. However, these plans were to be frustrated, as he was just the sort of man Cardinal Wiseman, the newly arrived head of the Catholic Church, desperately needed. Manning was therefore persuaded to enter the priesthood on Trinity Sunday, 14th of June, 1851. Wiseman told him, "I look upon you as one of the first fruits of the restoration of the hierarchy by our Holy Father, Pius IX. Go forth, my son, and bring your brethren and fellow countrymen into the one true fold of Christ." Post-Reformation persecution. The Catholic Church he joined was very different from the one we know now. Well, we're in trouble now as well. For about 250 years after the Reformation, Catholics faced intense persecution. Both laity and priests risked execution for their beliefs, the confiscation of their property, as well as being banned from political life, the legal profession, or attending the universities. And of course, no royalty could marry a Catholic. The Vatican treats England as a missionary province. By the late 18th century, the Catholic Church had almost been wiped out. with Edmund Burke calculating in 1780 that there were only 70,000 Catholics left in the whole country, principally concentrated in isolated valleys in the north of England. They had only survived because of the support provided by Catholic local aristocratic families. There were no churches, only chapels attached to country houses. Their attitude to life was to keep a rigidly low profile. Priests did not wear clerical garb and were addressed as Mr., not Father. Their faith was also antiquated, as many devotional practices, such as the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament, were unknown. The conventional diocesan structure had also been wiped out. From 1623, the Vatican administered England as a missionary province run by the Congregation of Propaganda in Rome. Priests were normally provided by regular orders, principally Jesuits. A highly introverted community without structure. Thus, English Catholicism in the early 19th century was essentially a highly introverted community, dominated by proudly old Catholic aristocratic families that totally lacked the modern parish and diocesan structure. This presented big problems to Wiseman when he tried to restore normal ecclesiastical authority in 1851. And it explains the bitter infighting which sadly so bedeviled the next 30 years or so. One big problem was that members of the religious orders were responsible to their own superiors, not to the local bishops. The issue was not finally resolved until 1881, when persistent campaigning by the then Cardinal Manning resulted in the papal bull Romanos Pontifices. This ruled that the regular orders had to get the bishop's prior consent before they could open any new school or religious community in a diocese. Popular prejudice. The intense anti-Catholic propaganda of the Reformation period had also left its mark in a strong popular prejudice of no popery. Thus bursts forth again when the English Catholic hierarchy was finally restored on 29th of September 1850. The Times was typical. The Pope and his advisers have mistaken our complete tolerance for indifference to their designs. They have mistaken the renovated zeal of the Church in this country for a return to Romish bondage. England's first census. England's first census, held in 1851, recorded a Catholic population of just over 250,000. However, this missed a massive influx of Irish people who had recently immigrated to flee the horrors of the Great Famine. Most historians believe that the true number in 1851 was probably around 700,000. 100,000 old Catholics and 100,000 Catholics living in the new industrial cities in Lancashire and Yorkshire, and 500,000 desperately poor Irish, generally living in the slums of big cities, London, Liverpool, Manchester and Birmingham. I've lived in London and Manchester, I've been to both those other cities, though. Priestly formation needed to be centralised. When the French Revolution launched a massive attack on the Catholic Church in France from 1790 onwards, the Vatican responded by excuse me, I better take a sip of the drink. I don't want to be coughing all the way through. Excuse me a moment. Priestly formation needed to be centralised. When the French Revolution launched a massive attack on the Catholic Church in France from 1790 onwards, the Vatican responded by reasserting the central authority of the Pope, a movement generally called Ultramontanism. Increased papal authority was generally welcomed outside England, but the old Catholics clung to their independent or liberal Catholic traditions. Cardinal Wiseman was utterly convinced that the English Church had to be built on ultramontane lines to bring it into line with the Church elsewhere. Chapels located in isolated valleys in the north of England were of little help to the newly arrived poor Irish, who needed the construction of churches on a large scale, and the rapid expansion of priestly formation, which could only be done in a centralised way. Old Catholic resistance and poor Irish need. However, the vast majority of the clergy he inherited were hardly surprisingly from an old Catholic background and bitterly resistant to his proposed changes and new Italianate devotions. On the other hand, the poor Irish welcomed the rousing ritual he brought with him. For them, the local Catholic Church was their only social centre in a life of hard labour and slum dwelling. In 1850, there were 587 Catholic churches in England and Wales, and 788 clergy. By 1900, there were 1,529 churches and 2,812 clergy. The 700,000 Catholics of 1851 became 1,300,000 by 1901. In ecclesiastical historian Sheridan Gillies' words, it was, however, arguably the ultramontanisation of the church that made it a success, as the new gaudy chapels with their altars and statues and smell of incense and melted beeswax projected a sense of the sacred. Wiseman advocates ritualism and ultramonatism. Wiseman himself was a distinguished scholar and founder of the Dublin Review, to which he was a regular contributor, a good judge of people, and politically aware. He liked exuberant ritual and hosting fine dinners, but he also made a point of visiting the poor in the slums of London. Yet both the ritualism and the ultramontanism were deeply unpopular with the old Catholic laity, as Edward Norman put it. They sensed that his clericalism would exalt the priesthood and depress the laity, to the point at which they would lose all influence. Wiseman, for his part, saw the universal authority of papal monarchy as an essential barrier against the indifferentism and infidelity of the age. And although he was open to modern scholarship as he understood it, he saw English Protestantism all round him sinking into liberalism and ultimate scepticism, and it's gone down and down and down since then. Wiseman seizes on Manning's skills. Wiseman also had one major weakness. He was poor at administration. Given this weakness and the lack of domestic support for his ultramontane views, it must have seemed providential to Wiseman when Manning, a brilliant administrator and committed ultramontane himself, turned up a few months after his own arrival in England. Manning's rapid rise through the ranks of the Church in the next few years may seem surprising at first sight, given the widespread suspicion of converts. However, it is not when his beliefs and skills are taken into account. Wiseman sent him to Rome to study. After ordination, Wiseman sent him to Rome to study at the Academia Ecclesiastica, generally regarded as a place for future cardinals. Manning had become fluent in Italian in his youth, a huge advantage when he was in Rome. In the autumn of 1851, Manning went to Rome along with Aubrey de Vere. The loss of Caroline's letters severs all bonds to earth. However, when they stopped at Avignon, disaster struck, as a small black bag containing Caroline's letters was stolen. They were never recovered, de Vere wrote. At the first moment after the discovery of the loss, the expression of grief in his face and voice was such as I have seldom witnessed. He spoke little, and when I was beginning to speak, he laid his hand upon my arm and said, "Say nothing. I can just endure it when I keep perfectly silent." We met again at Rome. He met my enquiries with a brief reply. No, the loss was probably necessary to sever all bonds on earth to earth. The first ever synod of the Catholic bishops. When he reached Rome, he quickly established a close rapport with the Pope. Travelling back in the summer of 1852, he met a 20-year-old candidate for the priesthood, Herbert Vaughan, who, after initial wariness of the old parson, became devoted to him. 1852 was also the year of the first ever synod of the Catholic bishops, held at Oscott near Birmingham. Wiseman invited both Manning and Newman to give prominent sermons, the latter declaring, "It is the coming in of a second spring. It is a restoration in the moral world." I think we should bring back these two cardinals alive, because they were good for the church, weren't they? A mission to raise the status of the secular clergy. When Manning finished his studies in Rome in September 1854, the Pope asked him to stay at Rome and offered him the post of papal chamberlain. However, he came back to fulfill Wiseman's idea that the London poor could only be truly helped by raising the status of the secular clergy among them. Wiseman had previously asked the regular orders, such as the Jesuits, to help him do this, but they had declined. In 1853, Manning got a handwritten note at the Academia from Wiseman asking him to return to England. Wiseman wanted an oratory with an external action, secular clergy whose spiritual life was sanctified by a life lived in community. Father Superior of the Oblates. Manning totally agreed and used the model of the Oblates founded by St. Charles Borromeo in Milan 300 years before. He found a half-completed church in Bayswater, an undeveloped area then on the fringes of London, and got it finished by July 1857. He later described his years as Father Superior with the Oblates as the happiest period of his life. Manning's enthusiasm and energy quickly led to Bayswater becoming a major centre of Catholic life in London. The initial group of 7 priests grew to 20 within 3 years, despite several of them dying of typhus. The number of communicants grew from 100 to 1,000. By 1865, when Manning left the area, had 3 Catholic churches, 4 convents and 8 Catholic schools. Manning's intense religious devotion marked all who knew him. As one oblate remarked, he left so holy a power upon our lives. Disputes between Wiseman and the Old Catholics. Unfortunately for Manning, his hopes of a quiet life of pastoral service were to be spoiled because of disputes between Wiseman and the Old Catholics. When he came to England in 1851, Wiseman had to try to appease them by appointing George Errington, a leading Old Catholic and expert canon lawyer, as his coadjutor, with right of succession to the diocese. Unfortunately, this did not work, as Errington campaigned against Wiseman's policies almost from the start. To strengthen Wiseman's hand, in 1857, Pius IX personally nominated Manning, to his great surprise, as provost of the Westminster chapter, to the outrage of the clergy there. Errington attacks Manning's Oblates. This seems to have prompted Errington, with the support of most of the chapter, to attack Manning's Oblates. He first disputed their right to the original church of St. Mary of the Angels in Bayswater, and then turned upon the Oblates, led by Vaughan, who had been sent by Manning to teach at St. Edmund's Seminary, where Manning had written to Rome. I do not believe that seminaries will ever be what they ought to be in England unless they are directed by secular priests who have learned to live by rule and can act with unity of mind and purpose. The Pope dismisses Errington. Errington ordered Manning to submit the rule of the Oblates to the Westminster chapter. Manning, backed by Wiseman, refused. Errington then referred the matter to Rome, essentially suing Wiseman. What a carry on. In response, Wiseman felt he had no alternative but to write to Rome in 1859 asking for Errington to be removed as coadjutor and his successor. The Pope decided that he had no alternative than to dismiss Errington. Pius IX publicly expressed his exasperation at these English priests who could not work together. The Italians think us all, Manning, Talbot, Newman, Ward, etc., are a lot of queer quarrelsome Anglesi. Wiseman comes to rely increasingly on Manning. In 1859, Wiseman suffered a heart attack. I'm not surprised. And from then on until the end of his life, poor health led him to rely increasingly on Manning. He wrote to Cardinal Barnabo, prefect of propaganda. I do not hesitate to say that in all England there is not another priest who in double time has done what Dr. Manning has for the advantage of the Catholic Church. Now that Errington has been dismissed, the question of who would indeed succeed the ailing Wiseman became ever more apparent as the 1860s progressed. This is not to say that Wiseman was not always his own man. When, for example, Manning asked him to make the highly respected Ullathorne Bishop of Birmingham Wiseman's own coadjutor and successor, he was sternly rebuked. Tense relations between Manning and Newman. The early 1860s also sadly saw, increasingly, tense relations between Manning and Newman. In 1861, Cardinal Wiseman set up a Catholic academy where leading Catholic thinkers could discuss important issues of the day. However, Newman, notoriously oversensitive, thought he had been slighted for some reason and withdrew his name. Manning later wrote, "From that day a divergence began between us. Manning was the main force behind its creation, as throughout his life he passionately believed that the Church had to engage with modern society and be prepared to answer new questions that arose from scientific discoveries or political changes. We are in the modern world, and we must brace ourselves to lay hold of the world as it grapples with us, and to meet it intellect to intellect, culture to culture, science to science." The champion of infallibility. Wiseman died on the 15th of February 1865, leading to intense speculation about his successor. Manning wrote to Rome indicating that as a convert, his own name should not be considered, and he again pushed for Ullathorne to take over. The Westminster chapter, in effect, sent only one name, Errington. Pius IX was outraged, declaring this an insulto al Papa. The Pope hears a voice saying Manning's name. The Pope now came under intense lobbying pressure, with the British government pressing for Errington, while propaganda advocated Ullathorne. Whilst praying for guidance, Pius IX had a revelation. I found myself truly inspired to nominate him, and I will always believe to have heard a voice saying, "Put him there, put him there." The English Church rallied around its new Archbishop. Him was, of course, Manning. When the official letter from propaganda reached him on 8th of May, he was found praying before the Blessed Sacrament in the Oratory Church. For once, Manning's iron emotional control had given way. He had been crying. Propaganda had been worried that Manning's appointment could split the church. But to Manning's surprise and joy, the English Church rallied round its new Archbishop. The struggle for souls seen in Manning's face. Before his consecration, Manning went on a week's retreat with the Passionists at Highgate. Whilst looking down on London from Highgate Hill, he wrote, "When I look down upon London from this garden, and know that there are before me nearly 3 million of men, of whom only 200,000 are nominally in the faith, to go down into the fire and into the water to save souls, and to be wounded by them, all this I look for. I see it, the struggle, in my face." Indeed, at his consecration at the Pro-Cathedral of Mary Moorfields on 8th of June 1865, the marks of deep suffering were visible on his face. In his youth, Manning had been regarded as one of the most handsome men in England. From now on, the cumulative effect of intense austerity and superhuman spiritual discipline made his face increasingly emaciated. People as a priority. The new Archbishop immediately showed his priorities. The leading Catholics of the day had raised £16,000 to build a new cathedral as a memorial to Wiseman. A huge sum in those days, when the ordinary worker earned £30 a year. Manning disappointed them by using the money instead to build schools and train priests, arguing, "Could I leave 20,000 children without education and drain my friends and my flock to pile up stones and brick?" Attention on the international church. However, the next few years were to see him spend much of his attention on the international church. The Middle Ages had left Italy and Germany divided into a large number of small states. with the papacy controlling the area around Rome. However, by the middle of the 19th century, the forces of nationalism were growing. In 1861, the Kingdom of Savoy conquered the rest of the country, creating the Kingdom of Italy under the slogan, "A free church in a free state." It confiscated Catholic property and restricted the church's activities throughout Italy. At the same time, Bismarck used the Prussian army to occupy the other German states, proclaiming the creation of a new German Empire, or a Second Reich, in 1871. Bismarck also launched a massive attack on the Catholic Church in the new Germany under the name of Kulturkampf, or Struggle for Culture. It was designed to assert the state's authority over the church and reduce its influence. 1,800 priests and most of the bishops were thrown into prison. The new biblical criticism. At the same time, another different threat was also coming from Germany. In the early 1800s, the German Protestant theologian Schleiermacher developed his new biblical criticism. This attacked the traditional understanding of both the Bible and the creeds, calling for a much more liberal church. From the 1850s onward, German Catholic scholars, such as Dollinger, advocated many of Schleiermacher's ideas, with support from liberal Catholics in England, such as Acton. In response, Pius IX responded by issuing the Syllabus of Errors in 1864, condemning the chief errors of the age: progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. The Pope calls a general council of the Church. Excuse me a moment. Sorry, this cold has not gone yet. The Pope decided to call a General Council of the Church, which opened in December 1869, to strengthen the Church from these two threats. The aim was to formally agree that in principle and in certain circumstances the Pope's teaching was infallible. Virtually all Catholic theologians agreed with this teaching, but many were concerned that publicly declaring it now could stir up further trouble for the Church, since they thought the time was not right. They were called inopportunists. Manning was the chief whip of the Infallibilist Party. Manning was the chief whip of the Infallibilist Party, not just because he thought that it was a useful supplement to ultramontanism against the encroachment of state power. To him it was much more than that, as infallibility lay at the basis of his personal faith. I noted earlier that throughout his early life he was seeking the rule of faith. He became a Catholic because he became, excuse me, he became convinced that only the Catholic Church had the certain means of turning divine revelation into infallible teaching. In 1865, he wrote in his journal, "When I was in a system of compromise, I tried to meditate, reconcile, and unite together those who differed. When I entered a system, excuse me, which being divine is definite and uncompromising, I threw myself with my whole soul and strength into its mind, will, and action." Manning used all his formidable political skills to ensure that the council agreed papal infallibility. He relentlessly lobbied the assembled bishops and took charge of the key committee, Deputation de Fide, so that it was dominated by infallibilist supporters. Manning also made full use of his renowned oratorical powers, giving the keynote speech in Italian for 2 hours on 25th of May 1870. He pointed out that papal infallibility is Catholic doctrine of divine faith, and all are obliged to hold it. It is not an open theological opinion, but a doctrine contained in the divine revelation. Does anybody here doubt the doctrine? Manning's astonishing prescience. Manning also fervently believed that the Christian faith was fading from Europe, and that its absence would open the road to totalitarian dictatorship, where men would worship their leaders, just as ancient Romans had worshipped Caesar. As he wrote to Gladstone, "Of this I am sure, as of the motion of the earth. My belief is that faith is gone from society as such. Morals are going, and politics will end in the paralysis of the governing power. The end of this must be anarchy or despotism. I have been a fearless radical all my life, and am not afraid of popular legislation. But legislation without principles is in strict sense anarchy. My belief is that society without Christianity is the communist dictatorship. What hope can you give me?" These warnings were made nearly 50 years before the Russian Revolution and 60 before Hitler took power, and show Manning's astonishing prescience. This was a time when it was almost universally accepted that human life was now in a period of unending improvement in economic and social affairs. Indeed, belief in progress was a characteristic of the Victorian period. Manning saw further in Norman's words. He had an almost apocalyptic sense that the civilized world, for so long sustained by Christianity, was sliding into chaos, a sense that some catastrophic for humanity was impending. Catholic unity, centralized in the papacy, was the only means, he believed, for Christendom to survive. He was definitely prophetic in his things that he wrote and said. I mean, it's incredible. Using his oratorical skills and fears for the future to persuade. He also used his oratorical skills and fears for the future to persuade the council. One bishop noted, Archbishop, by his vehement and vivid forecasts of the evils which threatened us, made my hair stand on end. Mine too. I shivered when I was reading that, but my hair didn't stand on end. It's too long. But there was a great deal of force in his arguments. Our opposition to the opportuneness of the definition was confined more or less to historical or theoretical objections. We gave little or no practical view of things, which Manning insisted upon, to the coming events in the political order, wars and revolutions which he predicted with such terrible earnestness. We were perhaps more of the theologians, he more of an ecclesiastical statesman. On 18th of July, the definition was approved by 433 votes in favour and 2 against. The timing could not have been more dramatic. A day later, France declared war on Germany, and the French troops who had been protecting Rome were withdrawn. The council had to be abandoned as Italian forces occupied the city. Infallibility and its relevancy. I suspect that some Catholics may regard this subject as archaic and irrelevant. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, 1994, says otherwise. S889. In order to preserve the Church in the purity of the faith handed on by the apostles, Christ, who is the truth, willed to confer on her a share in his own infallibility. By a supernatural sense of faith, the people of God, under the guidance of the Church's living magisterium, unfailingly adheres to this faith. S890. It is the magisterium's task to preserve God's people from deviations and defections, and to guarantee them the objective possibility of professing the true faith without error. To fulfill this service, Christ endowed the Church's shepherds with the charism of infallibility in matters of faith and morals. People sometimes suggest that the Second Vatican Council marked a huge change in the nature of the Church away from the model presented at the First Vatican Council. I would like to respond to such ideas by quoting from one of the definitive documents of the Second Vatican Council, Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the Church. Lumen Gentium states, "This infallibility with which the divine Redeemer wills his Church to be endowed in defining a doctrine of faith and morals extends as far as and extends the deposit of divine revelation, which must be religiously guarded and faithfully expounded. This is the infallibility which the Roman Pontiff, the head of the College of Bishops, enjoys in virtue of all office, when as the supreme shepherd and teacher of all the faithful, who confirms his brethren in their faith, Luke 22:32, he proclaims by a definite act some doctrine of faith or morals." The father of Catholic social teaching, when he returned from the Vatican Council, Mannings gave a series of 6 lectures published under the title "The Fourfold Sovereignty of God." It describes society as more than a collection of individuals. It is united, ordered, and organized by an intrinsic law of their nature. For when God made man, he made society. Society springs out of the creation of man, because from man comes the family, and from the family comes the people, and from the people comes the state. Christianity leading to morality. People today, in their ignorance, often accuse Christianity of being a negative force. Mannings knew that the opposite is true. For example, that it was Christianity which led to a society based upon morality rather than brute force. He was thinking particularly of ancient Rome, a great civilization that was built upon a massive slave terrorized state by the threat of torture and crucifixion. When this military superpower imploded in the 5th century, Europe collapsed into the chaos of the Dark Ages before a new civilization based upon Christian principles emerged. What has the world then gained by the sovereignty of Jesus Christ? The extinction of slavery, and let any man weigh what those words mean, remembering what slavery was in the ancient world. Secondly, the sanctification of Christian households by the laws of marriage and the laws of domestic purity. Again, a quality unknown before Christianity came on earth, unknown altogether in the heathen world, was infused into the hearts of men. That is charity, a tenderness and a human sympathy of man for man. It is a fact too well known to dwell upon that in the heathen world not a hospital was to be found, even in its most advanced civilization before Christianity. The sick died without mercy. He criticized the secular idea of progress. He criticized the secular idea of progress which dominated thinking in the 19th century, arguing that progress signifies an advance in the order of perfection. Manning also noted that British politicians were already talking of religious difficulties, which they claimed were preventing children being educated together in a common way, and warned posterity that this was only the beginning of attacks on the Church. 140 years later, when employees are sacked for daring to wear a cross, I couldn't wear that, could I, at work? In many places they wouldn't allow it, would they? This is my Benedictine one. I lost my other one 2 days ago, which is plain wood, but you couldn't wear one like this in a workplace, I don't think. And Catholic adoption agencies are forcibly closed by the state. We can only and sadly admire his perseverance. Modern civilization is making progress, it is true, but what will it progress to? To the utter and entire rejection of Christianity, to the abolition of the religious difficulty from legislation, from education, and from domestic life, to the relegating and banishing of religion from all public life, to the individual conscience and private life of man. There is yet a time of stillness and indifference. Liberalism is a twilight state in which all errors are softened, in which no persecution for religion will be countenanced. It is the stillness before the storm. A public debate with Gladstone on the state. Manning's views led him to a public debate with Gladstone about the encroaching power of the state, but again, his pessimism and prescience has been vindicated by history. As one scholar notes, the conflict now raging, Manning maintained, was nothing less than one between Christianity and anti-Christianity. It would be fought out over issues having to do with education, laws concerning marriage and family, public and private morality. Manning described himself as a mosaic radical, i.e., example, his vision was based upon the moral law handed down to Moses. For example, the 10 Commandments. Sheridan Gilly has highlighted Manning's prophetic vision. It was, however, The apocalyptic element in Manning's vision, which made him a prophet, responding to the drama of a world which was being transformed, Manning looked into two great neighbouring abysses, the abyss of unbelief and the abyss of revolution from below, and saw European society rushing towards them. 30 years after Manning's death, Hilaire Belloc reminisced, "The profound thing which Cardinal Manning said to me was this: all human conflict is ultimately theological." Education of the poor. Throughout his life, Manning was concerned about the education of the poor. One of his top priorities when he became Archbishop was establishing primary schools for the poor of the diocese. He was particularly concerned about the way poor, orphan Irish children detained in workhouses were being brought up in ignorance of the faith, and he used his influence with Gladstone to have an amendment to the Poor Law passed, which obliged workhouses to release them if requested. These children were not then left alone on the streets. The Archbishop founded Catholic industrial schools where children lived and learnt a trade along with the faith. A government inspector found that an industrial school founded by Manning at Ilford was the best in the country. In his Lenten pastoral of 1890, he looked back on this work. By 1889, the Westminster Diocese had 18,912 Catholics in junior schools, compared with 11,000 in 1865. Over 10,000 children had been rescued from workhouses, with 4,500 of these trained at industrial schools. In Gray's words, Manning's determination to ensure that poor children should not be lost to the faith shows him at his best. His concern for the unfortunate and his pastoral zeal, combining with his great administrative ability, he was easily the most accomplished and beneficent man of affairs the Church has possessed in England since the Reformation. Foster's 1870 Education Act created new board schools, completely funded by the government deliberate policy to try and push the church schools out of existence. By 1884, financial pressures had forced more than 1,000 voluntary schools to close, although intense effort kept all of the Catholic schools open. Their survival was only due to Manning's shrewdness in encouraging religious orders, particularly nuns, to come forward as unpaid teachers. How shall Catholics vote at the coming parliamentary election? When in 1885 the Liberal Joseph Chamberlain announced plans for local boards to take over the running of voluntary schools, the Cardinal felt that this attack on Catholic schools forced the Church to abandon its normal rule of political neutrality and published an article, "How shall Catholics vote at the coming parliamentary election?" Opposing the Liberals who lost, Lord Salisbury's new Conservative government appointed a commission, led by Lord Cross, to look at the working of the 1870 Education Act, with Manning the dominant figure on it. The Cross Commission recommended that voluntary schools should receive the same level of aid as the board schools implemented by the 1902 Education Act. A Catholic university. In 1872, Manning set up a Catholic university in London. The policy of the Catholic Church at the time was strongly against young Catholics going to non-Catholic universities. The new university was designed to provide an attractive and theologically sound alternative, as Manning worried. Count de Maistre has said that history since the Reformation has been a conspiracy against the Catholic Church. We may say that philosophy since Descartes has, to a wider extent than suspected, joined in the conspiracy, and yet these are essentially the history and philosophy delivered at the English universities. Unfortunately, the new university was badly run and inadequately funded and forced to close after a few years. Made a cardinal and proposed for the papacy. In 1875, Pius IX made Manning a cardinal, and when he died in 1878, Mannings was one of the names put forward as his replacement, the first time since the Middle Ages that an Englishman had been so honoured. However, he himself strongly argued that the Church needed another Italian pope, and Leo XIII was elected, calling for a change of policy in Ireland. Manning was unusual for an English Roman Catholic leader in shaping English attitudes to Ireland, at that time part of the British Empire. The Irish countryside seethed with unrest following the horrors of the Irish famine from 1847 onwards, when over 1.25 million people, a quarter of the population, are estimated to have died from hunger. The English authorities did little to help. Sir Charles Trevelyan, the senior civil servant responsible for funding relief, argued in his 1848 book, The Irish Crisis, that the famine was simply the inevitable result. What a lie! Oh, I'm furious about this. My son's father was Irish. This is awful. What a cheek! That was simply the inevitable result of Irish overbreeding, as Malthus had predicted. The renowned classic scholar Benjamin Jowett, master of Balliol College, Oxford, wrote, "I have always felt a certain horror of political economists since I heard one of them say that he feared that the famine in 1848 in Ireland would not kill more than 1 million people, and that scarcely enough to do much good. This is the Poor Law Act of 1847 incorporated the Gregory provision, which denied poor relief of any kind to anyone in Ireland who possessed more than a quarter acre of land. The Poor Law Commission's aim was to make farming more efficient by encouraging land clearance and emigration. I mean, they were evil days what they did. We British did to the Irish people. It was evil. The two great deficiencies in Ireland are want of capital and want of industry. By destroying small tenancies, you obtain both. Starving Irish Catholic peasants saw no reason to pay rents to what they felt to be grasping absentee Protestant English landlords, but that's so true. Secret societies threatened rent collectors, maimed animals, and burned down buildings owned by the state. The British government's initial response to this unrest was through repression, but this only controlled and did not solve the problem. From the 1880s onwards, Parnell founded the Land League, who pushed for land reform and some kind of home rule. Manning takes up the Irish claim. Well done, Manning. Only one prominent English figure called for a change of policy in Ireland, Cardinal Manning. In 1868, he published the letter to Earl Grey, arguing that there had to be religious equality, i.e. the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland and the abolition of the infamous land laws, which gave tenants no protection against arbitrary eviction or draconian rent increases. He took up the Irish claim of the 3 F's: fair rents, fixity of tenure, and free sale. The Quarterly Review had previously declared that it has been the pleasure of Ireland to pass upon itself a sentence of perpetual poverty. The letter to Earl Grey pulled no punches. Did Ireland suicidally strip itself of all its lands, reduce itself to mud cabins, potato diet and evictions, fever and famine? Who checked its agriculture, its cattle, trade, its fisheries, and its manufactures by Acts of Parliament? If poverty was ever inflicted by one nation on another, it has been inflicted on Ireland by England. The Cardinal's lobbying led to Gladstone's Land Acts of 1870 and 1881, fulfilling most of Manning's proposals. He also adopted the controversial position of public support for the Land League, although never for violent action, and he persuaded the Pope to reject the British government's request to condemn it. In 1881, an Irish priest visiting Manning. When dinner was over and the visit to the Blessed Sacrament, the Cardinal drew me into the corridor and said, "Oh, I fear very link of affection between the two countries is broken." "Yes," I said, "all but one." "What is that?" said the Cardinal. "Our love for you." Said I. I shall never forget how he looked me through when he answered, "Do you mean that?" I said, "You're the last man in England to whom I would say that if I did not believe it to be true." And the dear old man burst into tears. after a bit, almost under his breath, "It is what I have prayed for. It is what I have prayed for." I don't think many men have seen Manning cry. What a lovely story. He was a good man. Practical ecumenism. The Victorians had a strong tendency to ignore the dark underworld of their time, but Manning always reached out to the despised. In the 1870s, he campaigned for better conditions in prisons, and obtained the right for them to have Catholic chaplains. He was also not afraid to question Victorian hypocrisy against women. In Victorian London, priests and doctors could go into slums that police were afraid to enter. The aged cardinal advised them, "Give yourself to London. It is the abomination of desolation. No one knows the depths of the sufferings of the women, save the doctor and the priest." Raising the age of responsibility. In the mid-1880s, the Cardinal, along with Bramwell Booth, the leader of the Salvation Army, and the newspaper editor W.T., stead-shocked polite society with their revelations of widespread child sex trafficking in London. As a result, the age of responsibility for sexual intercourse was raised from 13 to 16 in order to make it easier to convict the traffickers. Bramwell Booth said of Manning, "I do not think that outside the Salvation Army I ever met a man who more uncompromisingly brought his religion into everything he touched, into everything he wrote, into everything he planned. He did it with the most exquisite tact and without the slightest suggestion of putting himself forward. But he did it." Campaigning to prohibit the opium trade, well, failed. It's still in existence. As one scholar notes, no one could describe Manning as an ecumenist before his time, and he was dismissive of movements for church reunion. However, he had a strong willingness to work with other churches on social issues. For example, together with Anglican and Methodist leaders, he campaigned to prohibit the opium trade in the British Empire. Expressing admiration for John Wesley, the Cardinal also shocked and surprised many Catholics by expressing his admiration for John Wesley. Well, why not? The man did good, didn't he? If it had not been for the teaching of John Wesley, no man can tell how deep in degradation England would have sunk. Probably Manning's greatest sympathy with Wesley came in the field of alcohol. Wesley had not been against wine as such, but was wary of its social impact. For example, he had objected to the way that the tavern keepers of his day were exploiting the weakness of the poor to enrich themselves, whilst driving the poor deeper into penury. Manning took the temperance pledge himself in 1872, and he founded the Catholic League of the Cross, although by 1876 58,000 people had joined it. Both this campaign and Manning's collaboration with other churches was not popular with the rest of the hierarchy, as Gilly has observed. In the 1870s, Manning's social activism placed the Catholic Church at the forefront of the movement for social and political reform. Conservative Catholics shuddered when Manning appeared on a largely Protestant platform to endorse the primitive Methodist Joseph Archer's Agricultural Union when he denounced the programs against Russian Jews, when he applauded the social activism of the Salvation Army. Popular with the working classes, the Cardinal was undeterred by this sniping. In 1872, he supported the creation of a trade union for agricultural workers. He had fought for better conditions for country labourers since ministering to them in Sussex 40 years earlier. In 1884, he served on the Royal Commission led by Dilke to inquire into the housing of the working classes. This gave great encouragement to the newly created London County Council in building cheap social housing. Owen Chadwick admitted, with the working classes, he was the most popular clergyman in England. In the 19th century, the lives of most working people was a combination of hard toil and little reward, and it's going back that way now very fast. Historians have called it the Bleak Age. No one of importance really challenged the free market or laissez-faire orthodoxy of the day until Cardinal Manning went to the Leeds Mechanics' Institute in January 1874 to lecture on the dignity and rights of labour. That's not the Labour Party, but the People's Labour. The speech begins by noting that industrialists were fond of quoting Thessalonians 2:10. If a man will not work, neither will he eat, but that they ignored Luke 7. The labourer is worthy of his hire. Amen. Alleluia. The dignity and rights of labour. Manning pointed out that the hard lives of the workers was a political risk, as it was a fertile breeding ground for extreme politics. He made certain key recommendations. Employers should not pay starvation wages, which turned the worker into a wage slave. For a free society demanded that labour should have some choice where and how it worked, and a starving man had none. He asked that recognition should be given to associations of working men, and pointed out the work of mutual support which had been carried out by the medieval guilds, those he must mean in the City of London. Lastly, or perhaps they were throughout the whole land, lastly he requested some consideration for the family, pointing out how families of 14 or 15 were huddled together in one room, usually in appalling sanitary conditions. Nevertheless, despite his advocacy for the poor, he was keen to warn against emerging Marxist ideas, which were then gaining currency. When I see the word proletariat in a book, I suspect the book at once. Manning's influence on the great social encyclical Rerum Novarum. All these ideas, the need for decent wages, the right to form trade unions, and the family at the basis of society, are the major themes running through the great social encyclical Rerum Novarum, issued by Pope Leo XIII in May 1891. Indeed, Manning had a profound influence on that document. When the Latin original was produced, Manning was sent a copy with a request that he should be the official translator into English. The Pope added that he was grateful for the influential communications he had received from the English cardinal prior to writing it. Archbishop Walsh wrote to Manning from Rome that he traced your Eminence's influence in this as in many other things. McClelland notes that. Manning was always listed to with awe at Rome because of his great record in the shaping of church policy, and because of his particular interests in the field of labour-church relations. In July 1891, Manning wrote a review of Rerum Novarum for the Dublin Review. His conclusion can be seen as a good justification of Catholic social teaching. For a century, the civil powers in almost all the Christian world have been separating themselves from the Church, claiming and glorifying in their separation. They have set up the state as a purely lay and secular society, and have thrust the Church from them. And now, of a sudden, they find that the millions of the world sympathize with the Church, which has compassion on the multitude rather than with the state. That's probably why they locked down the churches over this other nonsense. We should never have agreed to shut our churches, ever, for any reason. Never, never, never. Never. It should never have happened. I'll get back to this. They've set up the state as a purely lay and secular society, and have thrust the Church from them. And now of a sudden they find that the millions of the world sympathize with the Church, which has compassion on the multitude rather than with the state or the plutocracy which has weighed so heavily upon them. The similarity of thought and tone with the encyclical can be seen from the passage from Rerum Novarum below. I'm going to read it. By degrees, it has come to pass that working men have been given over, isolated and defenceless, to the callousness of employers and the greed of unrestrained competition. The evil has been increased by rapacious usury, and to this must be added the custom of working by contract and the concentration of so many branches of trade in the hands of a few individuals, so that a small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the masses of the poor a yoke A yoke little better than slavery itself, and it's like that now, getting worse in this year, 2022. It's just as bad. Conditions that people are under have gone back into the dark ages because of this Tory government. And Labour aren't a lot better. You're just as bad as them now. You've gone their way instead of the people's way or the trade union way. Labour, you're a load of rubbish compared to what you used to be. His life's work for the people. In my opinion, Manning may truly be described as the father of Catholic social teaching. Personally, I'm also pleased that he lived just long enough to see a papal encyclical endorsing his crusades for social justice, and Alan McClelland agrees. The old man could be forgiven, perhaps, for rejoicing that Rerum Novarum had set the final seal of approval upon his life's work for the people, and in so doing had confounded his critics, which is what we started with at the beginning of the booklet. Manning's role in the Great Dock Strike. Manning's role in ending the Great Dock Strike of 1889 brought him international recognition. This strike was a major event in economic history, as it was the first time that a mass union had successfully organised a major strike. It was recognised as such at the time. The dock strike took the world by surprise. It was something quite new, upsetting all men's calculations. At this time, relatively unskilled workers, such as dockers, were very much the bottom of the pile. They were casual labourers who queued up twice a day in the call-on system to be hired by the hour. They were paid 5 pence, and in brackets 2.1p, an hour. Often many of the men who had waited for hours got no work, and hence no money for them or their families. The final straw that led to the strike breaking out was the decision by the West India Docks Company in the summer of 1889 to cut the plus money, the small bonus paid to dock crews for rapid completion of the work. On the 14th of August 1889, the dock workers, hurrah, hurrah, walked out, demanding a minimum work shift of 4 hours and an increase in wages to 6p an hour, called the Dockers' Tanner. Although there was a union led by Ben Tillett, it was small and had minimal resources. The dock owners believed that financial pressures would soon force them back to work. However, to general surprise, other workers in the port of London, such as the stevedores and firemen, joined the strike. By 27th of August, there was in effect a general strike in the docks with 130,000 men. Of course, the poorly paid dockers had no savings, and hunger would have soon ended the strike had it not been for a wave of support throughout the East End, with churches establishing soup kitchens and for financial support arriving from abroad, especially Australia. Well, I hope you're listening to this, Deborah, so they sent some help from there, where you are. The strikers were keenly aware of the legal background and while there was picketing, it was peaceful, with no recorded intimidation. By the beginning of September, the strike was paralysing Victorian London. The dock owners threatened, like they do now probably, to import workers from the continent to break the strike. The government decided that a means had to be found to settle it, and a committee of conciliation was established on the 5th of September at the Mansion House, led by the Lord Mayor, representatives of the dock owners, and Cardinal Manning. Hey, hey. The latter wrote, "I became certain that fresh efforts were about to be made to bring labourers from a distance, which would lead to violent resistance, probably to bloodshed. Finding that no other mediation acceptable to the combatants appeared to be available, I resolved to offer my humble services with the endeavour to bring them together." The committee then met with the dockers' leaders, Ben Tillett and Tom Burns. However, agreement over the dockers' tanner could not be reached. Negotiations almost collapsed, and only Manning's iron will and his warnings of potential bloodshed kept the committee intact. He then single-handedly negotiated with both the dockers and the owners. For 4 days over the following weekend, the 81-year-old Cardinal pressed both sides to come to an agreement. Finally, he got the dockers' leaders to agree that the 6-pence rate could come into force on the 1st of November rather than immediately. He then spent several more days persuading the dock owners to accept, which they finally did. Manning later stated, "I never in my life preached to so impenitent a congregation." The Morning Post captured the general mood. "The result is due, in a great measure, to the individual efforts of Cardinal Manning, who has laboured assiduously in spite of his 81 years. That was really a feat, wasn't it? The eternal priesthood. In 1883, Manning wrote his greatest spiritual work, A Practical Guide to Priestly Ministry, entitled The Eternal Priesthood. Norman rates the book highly. His intellectual interests were wide, however, and he wrote with a deceptive simplicity a number of short works, which had great spiritual depth, especially the Eternal Priesthood. The book consists of 22 chapters with titles like The Nature of Priesthood or The Priest's Dangers, and it sets out his high vision of priestly vocation. Excuse me a moment. Sorry, I've got to take a sip of drink. I'm nearly at the very end. I didn't know how long this would take to read, but I'm nearly there. The offering of the body and blood of Christ requires of the priest a spirit of self-sacrifice and of self-oblation without reserve. The obligation of charity, which binds all Christians, when the need may arise, to lay down their lives for the brethren, and pastors to lay down their life for the sheep, is in an especial way laid upon every priest in their self-oblation of the Holy Mass, which is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Albertus Magnus and St. Thomas have said truly that no greater power or dignity of consecrating the body of Christ was ever bestowed on man, and no greater sanctity or perfection can be conceived than the sanctity and perfection required for so divine an action in the priest. Nevertheless, although the eternal priesthood is meant to be a practical guide, at times the author becomes almost poetical in his exaltation of the powers and huge responsibility of the priesthood. The priest has also jurisdiction over the mystical body of Christ. What can be more formidable than to stand between the living and the dead, charged with the priestly office, to give account for the souls committed to our trust? The Fathers call it an office which angels fear to bear. Sheridan Gilly notes that the book was highly influential. Manning's most influential work was The Eternal Priesthood, which is not only notable for its high ultramontane doctrine of the authority of the priest, but for its uncompromising otherworldly demand that the priest live a life of utter dedication and holy poverty like his Lord. Manning's influence on the Church. The Cardinal's influence on those who knew him was long-lasting, over 50 years in the case of Hilaire Belloc, whose political and social thought was explicitly based upon Manning's. Manning did seem to me much the greatest Englishman of his time. He was certainly the greatest of all that band, small but immensely significant, who in the Victorian period so rose above their fellows. The case of Virginia Crawford is worth noting. In the early 1880s, Manning became friends with the leading minister, Sir Charles Dilke. However, in late 1885, Dilke's political career was destroyed when he was accused by a Mr. Crawford of adultery with his wife Virginia. Virginia was divorced and became a social outcast. Distraught, she sought counsel from the Cardinal, and on February the 4th, 1889, she was received into the Catholic Church. the rest of her life until her death in 1948 was devoted to Manning's causes. On behalf of the Catholic Emigration Society, she visited the Canadian settlements of English and Irish children. She was one of the pioneers of the Catholic Social Guild, a society formed to make known Catholic social teaching, especially the encyclical Rerum Novarum. She could never stop talking about Manning. Cardinal Manning died on the morning of the 14th of January, 1892. His successor, Herbert Vaughan, had been embarrassed by Manning's social campaigns, and this work was abandoned. Yet Manning's achievements were never entirely forgotten. In 1950, the English bishops commissioned a major volume of essays to commemorate the restoration of the hierarchy in 1850. The first essay, by Father Philip Hughes, has much on Manning. Alas, the leader of genius formed no school, left no Elisha to catch his mantle as he sped from earth, but the memory of his universal sympathies, of his generous indignation, of his virile public courage, remained to animate a younger generation, and to strengthen the outspoken sympathies of the great cardinal of the war years, Arthur Hinsley. Nor are the echoes yet silent of Manning's mighty veracity. Indeed, Hinsley, who was Archbishop of Westminster from 1935 to 1943, campaigned for the poor during the Great Depression of the 1930s, which my mother told me about that. She was born in 1920. I was born in 46, so just as Manning had done in his time. As the Herald wrote, "Not since Manning has Britain had a cardinal who so closely identified himself with the lives of the common people." In 1939, Cardinal Hinsley hosted a celebratory dinner to mark the 50th anniversary of the dock strike, with organiser Tom Burns present. This dinner was recorded by a promising young priest called John Heenan, who in his turn became Archbishop of Westminster from 1963 to 1975. 3 cardinals, 3 workers for the common good of England. The public's demand of affection. Immediately after the cardinal's death, the magazine Merry England published a series of memorials about him that show the public's massive depth of affection for a warmly loved figure. I think that English Catholicism was traumatized when Purcells' apparently authoritative, but in truth distorted and biased biography appeared 3 years later. It appeared to show that the beloved cardinal was in fact a cold and ruthless figure, consumed by ambition, because he wasn't that at all. It is my hope that this brief biography will help set the matter straight and restore Henry Manning to his rightful place, worthy of veneration, as one of the greatest leaders of English Catholicism. Let me end, however, with some words of Manning himself. The priest rewards from the eternal priesthood, and that's what I'm going to end with. And it's gone 2 hours 50 minutes. Can you believe it? I can't. The words from his own writing. If the pastoral office is to be loved everywhere, it is to be loved especially in England. We are the pastors of the poor, and poor ourselves, separate from courts and honours, slighted and set aside, in apostolic liberty, in faith and work, independent of all human authority, closely and vitally united with the See of Peter and with the Church throughout the world, heirs of the martyrs, saints, confessors of every age, from St. Augustine to this age. If you're still there with me, thank you for listening. May God bless you and heal you. I'm sending you his peace in abundance, and may you always be happy and joyful in the Lord. I was just looking to see if there's anything else. That was written by Russell Sparks. I won't be able to write everything up because it's late. I mean really late. I don't actually even know the time till I look at my phone. But I hadn't planned it would be so long. It's 1:52 a.m. That's how it goes, but it's quieter here at night anyway. It's 1:52 in the morning. Oh dear. Thank you so much. I'm sending you the peace of Christ and prayers, and we pray for the repose of his soul, and that he'll be shown in the light of glory which he deserves. Very, very good, holy man. God bless him. Thank you. Good night. I'll just turn this off now. God bless.